my knowledge, there are only so many instances in which you find talk about the Sabbath combined with bagpipes. And as you may have gathered, our server this morning is one of those instances. And another is a film from the early 80s called Chariots of Fire, wherein there are several bagpipes, and there is a significant instance in the plot that revolves around rightful observance of the Christian Sabbath. The film is about two young men who find themselves competing at the Olympics in the early 20s, and one of them is a Scottish missionary. And there's quite a tense moment in the film when this man realizes that one of the qualifying races in Paris, where the Olympics are being held, is taking place on Sunday. And he cannot run it. He says to the Prince of Wales, he says to the board of the Olympics that he simply cannot do it. And it all turns out all right because they wind up switching the event. He runs the 400 meters instead of the 100 meters. And of course, he breaks the world record. And we may think that based on this impression, all we need to do is rearrange our calendars slightly better, and we too will win the race, break world records, and all shall be well, and we won't really have to deal with the fact that things come up on Sundays. And likewise, from that, and from many other conversations we can have about what it might look like to observe the Sabbath, we can find that the Sabbath, or Sunday, depending on how you look at it, is more defined not by what we would do, but rather by what we wouldn't do. The character, and in actual fact based on the real human, Eric Liddell, the runner, did not run on the Sabbath. That was one of the things he would not do. And we are told likewise in Deuteronomy this morning that you're not to do any work. But rather than simply stopping there with the puzzled expression that comes from thinking, well, if not that, then what? And likewise, rather than stopping there and going no further because we can be convinced on any given day that the notion of resting every seventh day is just not possible. It may be very appealing, but not possible. And rarely do we get much further than that, than to say the fourth commandment is really a nice idea, but it's not very realistic these days. And the gift that this occasion opens up for us is to hear of the Sabbath perhaps in a slightly new way, and to invite us, each one and all together, to reimagine what it might look like, what it could look like for us to indeed observe that day of which even the Son of Man is Lord. What is so striking when you look at the 10 commandments as they're given in Deuteronomy is that this commandment is actually the longest one. It takes the most explanation. It's 4 verses long in our measurements. And yes, we hear, observe the Sabbath. Every seventh day is a Sabbath day unto the Lord, and you're not to do any work. But look who it is that the Sabbath is made for. When Jesus says that the Sabbath is made for humankind, according to Deuteronomy, that includes the head of a household, a spouse, it includes the children, it includes the servants, it includes resident aliens, those who don't even worship this God. They get to rest too. And in fact, the whole purpose of this commandment, as we're told, is so that your male and female slaves may rest as well as you. That this vision that God has and the desire that God has that every seventh day there should be rest for all of God's creation is truly for all of us, not even just for those of us sitting here or standing here on Sunday. And suddenly, this is no longer a matter just of my own personal piety, but this Sabbath rest becomes something which affects all of us and which we are all a part of, in that we enable one another to rest. And that is a new and larger thought than the smaller thought, perhaps, of what is allowed or isn't allowed on such a day. And it's that kind of conversation that the Pharisees are engaged with, quite rightly, when they see Jesus' followers picking off these heads of grain, presumably to eat them. And it doesn't compute. Because often the most tempting thing can be simply to hear what God is asking of us and then figure out how we can accomplish it and then carry on thereafter. And so these Pharisees say to Jesus, why are they doing what's not lawful? And Jesus, rather than simply answering that question or providing a very helpful and extensive list of things that are and aren't allowed on the Sabbath, pulls back and reveals something that is a gift that is offered to us even now and even in this place, which is that based on this reading from Mark, this Sabbath, this rest that God desires for all of us is to be a gift of healing and a gift of nourishment. That it is a day on which Jesus says, people rightly eat and are fed. And that when he goes into the synagogue and that man with paralysis in his hand stretches it out towards Jesus, he is healed. And that is the same kind of gift, the same kind of imperative that God offers to us, that we should find rest to our souls, and that we should find healing and food for the other 6 days that we embark upon before our next Sabbath rest. And what's so amazing about this is that it is actually, we find in Deuteronomy, an act of remembrance. You may recall a couple of weeks ago, Norman Wiersbe visited us and he talked about the Sabbath in terms of creation, that on the seventh day, God rested after everything God had created, and likewise we rest. But that's not what Deuteronomy is talking about here. That final move in our reading this morning says, remember how the Lord brought you out of Egypt. Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, observe the Sabbath to the Lord your God. It is not just healing, it's not just rest, it's not just nourishment that we receive, but it is the reminder that we need to hear over and over again that God who created us in God's very own image looks upon us and says that each of us is entirely worthy and entirely of value for the sheer fact that we belong to God. And we are children of God before and after anything else in the world. And likewise, we remember that because of that, we are to live differently. We don't simply have to toil endlessly, but the rest is ours because God is the Lord of that Sabbath and no Pharaoh and no one else. We hear in this psalmist saying, I hear an unfamiliar voice. I hear a voice I had not heard saying, I lifted the burden from you. I relieved your burden. You cried out to me, and I heard you. And in the words of a hymn we're going to hear played on some bagpipes later on, we might say, through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already safely come. And it was grace that brought us safe thus far. And that same grace will lead us home. Sabbath becomes not half so much about what we don't do or what we set aside as it is the gift that God is offering now. A gift of rest, a gift of healing and of nourishment, and a reminder of who we truly are, which is only that which we can see in the sight of God, and as Paul would put it, in the face of Jesus Christ. And one of the hardest things about observing the Sabbath, it seems to me, is that in order to be fed and to be healed, there must be a moment of knowing and sensing the hungry places in our life, the places that are wounded. And in resting, there can be an incredible disquiet to sit before the Lord and to feel that which is as yet unhealed, unfed in us and in our world. But we hear Paul say, light shines in the darkness. And we hear God say, open your mouth and I will fill it. So in this moment set aside for the worship of God, where we gather together for this glimpse of rest and feeding and remembrance, there is this Sabbath promised to us by God, who says, stretch out your hands. Whatever the troubles or tartans they may hold, and my restoration will be yours. Amen.
Amen.